I was standing in my driveway, staring at the massive propane tank that had just been delivered to my property in Scottsdale, Arizona, when I saw her marching across the street like she owned the entire neighborhood. The woman's name was Sharon Pemberton, and she was the president of our homeowners association, a position she wielded like a medieval executioner brandishing an axe. Her blonde hair was cut in that specific style that screamed entitlement, and her yoga pants probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. I knew instantly that this was not going to be a friendly visit. "Excuse me," Sharon called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I turned to face her, wiping the sweat from my forehead. It was June in Arizona, and the temperature was already pushing 100 degrees even though it was barely 10 in the morning. The delivery guys were still hooking up the connections to my house, their tools clanking against metal. "Installing a propane tank," I said, keeping my voice level. "The natural gas lines do not reach this far into the development yet, so I need this for my heating and cooking." My name is Vincent Quade, and I had moved into this cookie-cutter subdivision called Desert Palms Estates about 6 months earlier. The house was perfect for what I needed. A 3-bedroom ranch-style place with a decent backyard where my German Shepherd, Max, could run around. I worked from home as a software consultant, so the extra space for an office was crucial. Sharon's eyes narrowed as she looked at the tank. It was a 500-gallon propane tank, painted white to reflect the brutal Arizona sun. The previous owner had used electric for everything, but my research showed that propane was far more cost-effective in the long run, especially for the pool heater I had just installed. "That tank is enormous," Sharon said, pulling out her phone and snapping several pictures. "I am certain it violates our property guidelines." "I checked the covenants before ordering it," I replied, feeling my patience already starting to wear thin. "There is nothing in there about propane tank sizes." Section 12, subsection 4.7, Sharon rattled off without even looking at any documents. "All exterior installations must be aesthetically pleasing and cannot exceed reasonable dimensions for the property size." I stared at her. "That is incredibly vague." "What does reasonable even mean?" "It means I will be bringing this up at the next board meeting," Sharon said, her lips pursed. "And I expect you will need to remove this eyesore immediately." The delivery supervisor, a burly guy named Tom, walked over. "Madam, this is a standard residential tank. We install these all over the valley. There is nothing unusual about it." Sharon ignored him completely, her attention fixed on me. "You will be receiving a formal notice within 3 business days. Have a blessed day, Vincent." She turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her immaculate house with its perfectly manicured lawn and not a single thing out of place. I watched her go, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. "That lady seems fun," Tom said sarcastically. "She is a piece of work," I muttered. "How long until you guys are finished?" "Another hour, tops. Do not worry about her. Like I said, this tank is completely standard. We would not install something that violates code." I nodded, but I could not shake the feeling that this was going to become a much bigger problem than it should be. Sharon had a reputation in the neighborhood. I had heard stories from my next-door neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank Martinez, about how she had made another resident remove a basketball hoop because it was 3 inches too far into the driveway according to her interpretation of the rules. She had forced someone else to repaint their front door because the shade of beige was not on the approved color list, even though it was virtually identical to a dozen other doors in the neighborhood. True to her word, 3 days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The envelope had the Desert Palms Estates HOA logo on it, a ridiculous little palm tree and sunset design that probably cost thousands of dollars to create. I opened it while standing at my kitchen counter, Max sitting at my feet hoping for a treat. The letter was 2 pages long, filled with legal jargon and references to various sections of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The core message was simple. My 500-gallon propane tank exceeded the reasonable size limitations for exterior installations on my property size, and I had 30 days to remove it or face daily fines of $50. I read it 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rising with each pass. There was no specific measurement listed that my tank supposedly violated. No clear standard I could reference. Just Sharon's interpretation that it was too big. I pulled out my copy of the HOA documents, all 73 pages of them, and went through every single line. Section 12, subsection 4.7 did exist, but it was so vague as to be meaningless. It talked about maintaining aesthetic standards and ensuring that exterior modifications did not negatively impact property values or neighborhood harmony. There were no dimensions listed. No cubic footage limits. No height restrictions. Nothing concrete I could measure my tank against. The next morning, I called the HOA management company, a firm called Prestige Property Management that handled the administrative work for Desert Palms Estates. After navigating through an annoying phone tree, I finally reached a human being named Kelly. I am calling about a violation notice I received regarding a propane tank, I explained. The notice claims it is too large, but there are no specific dimensions listed in the covenants that it violates. Kelly sighed, and I got the impression this was not the first time she had dealt with something like this. Let me pull up your file. You are at 2847 Saguaro Lane, correct? That is right. I heard typing on a keyboard. Okay, I see the violation notice was issued by Mrs. Pemberton. What size is your tank? 500 gallons. It is a standard residential size. More typing. And you are saying there is no specific size limitation in your covenants. Exactly. The clause they are citing is completely vague. It just says installations must be reasonable and aesthetically pleasing. But reasonable to whom? What is the actual standard? Kelly was quiet for a moment. Mr. Quade, I am going to be honest with you. This development's covenants were written in 1998, and they have never been updated. There are a lot of gray areas. Technically, the board has the authority to interpret ambiguous clauses. So Sharon can just decide something violates the rules even if there is no specific measurement to reference. The board has discretion, yes. However, if you disagree with their interpretation, you have the right to request a hearing before the full board. You can present your case and they will vote on whether the violation stands. I leaned against my kitchen counter, processing this. How do I request a hearing? I can schedule one for you. The next board meeting is in 2 weeks. I will put you on the agenda. Please do that. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day researching propane tank regulations, HOA law in Arizona, and similar cases. What I found was not encouraging. Arizona law gave HOAs broad authority to enforce their covenants, and courts generally deferred to the board's interpretation, unless it was completely arbitrary or discriminatory. I also discovered that Sharon Pemberton had been the HOA president for 6 years. She ran unopposed every election because no one else wanted to deal with the headaches of managing the association. The other board members were mostly her friends or people who did not want to rock the boat. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared my case like I was going to trial. I gathered photos of propane tanks in other neighborhoods that were similar in size. I got written statements from 3 different propane companies confirming that 500-gallon tanks were standard for residential properties. I even hired a surveyor to create a detailed plot of my property, showing that the tank took up less than 1% of my total lot size, and was positioned according to all applicable fire and safety codes. The board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland rectangular building near the neighborhood entrance. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documents and a knot in my stomach. There were about a dozen other residents there, most looking bored or annoyed to be spending their Thursday evening at an HOA meeting. Sharon sat at a long table at the front of the room with 4 other board members. A middle-aged man named Gregory Walsh, who was the treasurer, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Donovan, who was the secretary, and 2 at-large members whose names I did not know. The meeting started with mundane business, discussion of the monthly budget, a proposal to repaint the community mailboxes, approval of new landscaping for the entrance. I sat through 45 minutes of this before Sharon finally looked at her agenda and said, "Next, we have a hearing request from Vincent Quade regarding a propane tank violation. Mr. Quade, you have 10 minutes to present your case." I stood and walked to the front of the room, very aware that everyone was now paying attention. I distributed copies of my documentation to each board member and began my presentation. I am here because I received a violation notice claiming my propane tank is too large for property guidelines. However, after thoroughly reviewing our covenants, I cannot find any specific size limitation that my tank violates. Section 12, subsection 4.7 mentions aesthetic standards and reasonable dimensions, but it provides no concrete measurements or standards to reference. I walked them through each piece of evidence, the statements from propane companies, the survey showing the tank's minimal footprint, photos of similar or larger tanks in nearby neighborhoods, fire code documentation showing my tank met all safety requirements. This is a standard residential propane tank, I continued. It is not oversized or unusual in any way. The violation notice is based on a subjective interpretation of an ambiguous covenant clause, not on any clear standard. I am asking the board to rescind the violation. Sharon did not even wait for me to sit down. "Thank you, Mr. Quade. However, the board has broad discretion to interpret our covenants, and we have determined that your tank is indeed too large. It is unsightly and negatively impacts the visual harmony of our neighborhood." "How?" I asked. "It is behind a screening fence that meets all requirements. You cannot even see it from the street." "That is irrelevant," Sharon said dismissively. "The size itself is the issue." Gregory Walsh, the treasurer, cleared his throat. "Sharon, I actually looked at Mr. Quade's property yesterday. He is right. You cannot see the tank from the street at all, and I have to say, I do not see how it violates any specific guideline." Sharon's face tightened. "It violates the spirit of our aesthetic standards. But there is no measurement to reference," Gregory pressed. "How do we define too large if there is no standard?" "The board has discretion," Sharon repeated, her voice getting harder. "That is clearly established in Arizona HOA law." Patricia Donovan, the secretary, was flipping through the documents I had provided. "These propane companies all confirm this is a standard size, and the surveyor's report shows it only takes up a tiny fraction of his property." I could see Sharon getting flustered. This was clearly not going the way she expected. "I move that we vote on this matter," she said abruptly. "I second," one of the at-large members said automatically. "All in favor of upholding the violation?" Sharon asked. Sharon and one at-large member raised their hands. Gregory, Patricia, and the other at-large member did not. Sharon's face went red. "The motion fails." "Mr. Quade, Your violation is rescinded." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. "However," Sharon continued, her voice icy, "I will be proposing an amendment to our covenants at next month's meeting to establish specific size limitations for exterior installations. And when that passes, you will need to bring your tank into compliance with the new standards." I stared at her. "You cannot change the rules retroactively just to target me." "Watch me," Sharon said. The meeting ended shortly after that, but I stayed behind to talk to Gregory and Patricia. They both seemed sympathetic. "Sharon has been getting more and more difficult," Patricia said quietly. "She thinks she owns this neighborhood. I am sorry you are dealing with this." "What are my options if she actually does try to pass a new amendment targeting my tank?" I asked. Gregory shook his head. "Covenant amendments require a vote of the full membership, 2/3 approval. That is not easy to get. Most people do not even show up to vote on these things." "But Sharon has been known to manipulate the voting process," Patricia added. "She controls who gets the proxy votes. She makes sure only her friends show up to meetings. I would not put it past her to find a way to get it passed." Over the next few weeks, I watched carefully as Sharon began her campaign. She sent out a neighborhood email talking about the importance of maintaining property values and aesthetic standards. She posted on the Desert Palms Estates Facebook group about how certain residents were installing industrial equipment that did not belong in a residential community. She never mentioned me by name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. I responded on the Facebook group, politely explaining that my propane tank was standard residential equipment, not industrial, and that it met all applicable codes and regulations. Several neighbors liked my comment and posted their own supportive messages. But Sharon's core group of followers attacked me, claiming I was selfish and did not care about the neighborhood. The proposed amendment came out 2 weeks before the vote. It established that any propane tank larger than 250 gallons was prohibited, and existing non-compliant installations would need to be removed within 90 days of the amendment's passage. 250 gallons was absurdly small. It would not be enough to run my heating, cooking, and pool heater through the winter months. I would need to refill it constantly, at significant expense. And the 250-gallon size limit had clearly been chosen specifically to target my tank, while sounding somewhat reasonable to people who did not understand propane systems. I started making phone calls. I reached out to every neighbor I knew, explaining the situation and asking them to vote against the amendment. Frank Martinez, my next-door neighbor, was immediately on board. "Sharon is a tyrant," he said. "She has been making life miserable for people in this neighborhood for years. It is about time someone stood up to her." Frank introduced me to several other neighbors who had their own grievances with Sharon. There was Linda Chen, who had been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden that Sharon claimed violated landscaping standards. There was Robert Thompson, who had fought with the HOA for months over replacing his roof with solar panels. There was Maria Sanchez, who had been cited for parking her work van in her own driveway because Sharon said commercial vehicles were prohibited, even though Maria's van was just a regular cargo van she used for her cleaning business. We formed an informal coalition. Frank created a detailed email explaining why the proposed amendment was unreasonable and specifically targeted one homeowner. We sent it to every resident in the neighborhood. Sharon responded with her own email, full of scare tactics about how propane tanks could explode and how failing to maintain strict standards would lead to our property values plummeting. She included photos of industrial-sized propane installations that had nothing to do with residential systems, trying to make people think my tank was somehow dangerous. The vote was scheduled for a Thursday evening in late July. The community room was packed. I had never seen this many residents at an HOA meeting before. Sharon looked pleased initially, probably thinking high turnout meant support for her amendment. But as the meeting progressed, it became clear that many people had shown up specifically to vote against her. When it came time for the vote on the amendment, resident after resident stood up to speak against it. Linda Chen talked about Sharon's pattern of selectively enforcing rules against people she did not like. Robert Thompson pointed out that the amendment was clearly retaliatory and targeted. Maria Sanchez said she was tired of Sharon acting like a dictator. Sharon's face got redder and redder. She tried to cut people off, claiming they were off topic, but Gregory Walsh kept overruling her and letting people speak. When the vote finally happened, it was not even close. Out of 247 homes in Desert Palms Estates, 186 residents cast votes either in person or by proxy. Only 68 voted in favor of the amendment. It needed 124 to pass. Sharon looked like she had been slapped. She stammered through the rest of the meeting and adjourned as quickly as possible. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I received another violation notice. This time, Sharon claimed my propane tank violated county fire codes because it was too close to my property line. The notice cited specific ordinance numbers and demanded I relocate the tank within 30 days or face immediate daily fines. I was furious. I called the Maricopa County Fire Marshal's office directly and explained the situation. They sent an inspector out the next day. The inspector, a professional woman named Officer Andrea Collins, examined my tank installation thoroughly. She checked the clearances, looked at the installation permits, and reviewed all the documentation. "Everything is completely in compliance," she told me. "Your tank is actually 4 feet beyond the minimum required setback from the property line. Whoever filed this complaint either did not know what they were talking about or deliberately lied." "Can you put that in writing?" I asked. "Absolutely." She printed out an official inspection report right there, stamping it with the county seal. "I am also going to note in my records that a false complaint was filed. If the same person keeps filing bogus complaints, there can be consequences for that." Armed with the fire marshal's report, I went straight to Sharon's house. She answered the door with a fake smile that vanished when she saw me. "The fire marshal inspected my tank," I said, holding up the report. "Everything is in full compliance. You filed a false complaint." Sharon's eyes flashed. I was acting on information provided to me. "What information? From who?" "That is confidential board business." "It is a lie, Sharon. You know it and I know it. This has to stop." She crossed her arms. "If you do not like how this HOA operates, maybe you should move. Or maybe you should stop abusing your position to harass residents you do not like." Sharon stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have been running this HOA for 6 years. I have connections. I know lawyers. I know county officials. You are just some tech worker who thinks he can waltz in here and ignore our standards. You will never win against me." I took a step back, genuinely unsettled by the venom in her voice. "This is not about winning. This is about you following the actual rules instead of making them up as you go." "Get off my property," Sharon said, and slammed the door in my face. I walked back to my house, my hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. Max met me at the door, sensing my mood, and I spent a few minutes just sitting on the floor petting him and trying to calm down. Over the next month, Sharon launched a campaign of petty harassment. I received a violation notice for my trash cans being visible from the street for more than 12 hours, even though they were only out on trash day like everyone else's. I got cited for having a lawn that was 1 inch too tall, measured on a day when half the neighborhood had similar grass height. I was fined for parking my car on the street overnight during a rainstorm when my garage was temporarily unusable due to a plumbing issue. Each violation was technically within Sharon's authority, but was applied selectively and vindictively. Other residents with similar or worse issues were ignored. It was clear she was trying to make my life miserable until I either gave up and moved or somehow bent to her will. I documented everything: photos, dates, comparisons showing other properties with the same supposed violations that were not cited. I filed formal appeals on every single fine, forcing Sharon to hold hearings and justify each one. Gregory Walsh and Patricia Donovan increasingly sided with me at these hearings, clearly fed up with Sharon's behavior. But Sharon always had enough votes from her two at-large cronies to keep most violations in place, even when they were obviously bogus. The situation came to a head in September. I received a violation notice claiming that my propane tank was leaking and posed an immediate safety hazard. The notice demanded I disconnect the tank immediately pending inspection and repair. This was serious because, if true, it could actually be dangerous. I called the propane company right away. They sent a technician out within 2 hours. The technician, whose name was David, used multiple detection devices to check for leaks. He found nothing. "Your system is completely sealed," he told me. "There is no leak anywhere. Who told you there was?" The HOA president, David, frowned. "That is a serious allegation to make without proof. Falsely claiming there is a gas leak can cause unnecessary panic and could even be illegal. Can you document that you found no leak, already doing it?" He wrote up a detailed inspection report, including readings from his detection equipment, and provided me with both a physical and electronic copy. I marched over to Sharon's house again, report in hand. This time her husband answered the door. He was a mild-mannered accountant named Dennis who always seemed embarrassed by his wife's behavior. "I need to speak with Sharon," I said. "She is not home." "When will she be back?" Dennis shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Vincent, I know Sharon has been giving you a hard time. I have told her to back off, but she does not listen to me. She is at a county planning meeting right now. She should be home around 8. Tell her I will be filing a formal complaint about the false gas leak allegation. This has gone way too far." Dennis nodded sadly. "I am sorry you are dealing with this. For what it is worth, I think your propane tank is fine." I went home and did exactly what I said I would. I filed a formal complaint with Prestige Property Management, documenting the false fire code violation, the false gas leak allegation, and the pattern of selective enforcement. I cited specific sections of Arizona HOA law that required board members to act in good faith and prohibited using their position for personal vendettas. Kelly from Prestige Property Management called me the next day. "Mr. Quade, I received your complaint. This is very serious. We are going to need to investigate these allegations." "I have documentation of everything," I told her. "Please send it all to me. I am going to escalate this to our legal department. If what you are saying is accurate, Mrs. Pemberton may have violated her fiduciary duty as an HOA board member." Over the next 2 weeks, Prestige conducted an investigation. They interviewed me, reviewed all my documentation, and also spoke with other residents about Sharon's behavior. They interviewed Gregory Walsh and Patricia Donovan, who apparently confirmed the pattern of selective enforcement and abuse of authority. The conclusion came in a letter to the full HOA board. Sharon Pemberton had repeatedly violated her duties as board president by selectively enforcing rules, filing false complaints, and using her position to harass a resident. The letter recommended the board vote to remove her as president and potentially remove her from the board entirely. An emergency board meeting was scheduled. Sharon fought back hard. She hired a lawyer who sent threatening letters to Prestige Property Management and to me personally, claiming defamation and promising legal action. But Gregory Walsh and Patricia Donovan had had enough. They rallied the other board members and convinced them that Sharon's behavior was exposing the HOA to liability. At the emergency meeting, the board voted 4-1 to remove Sharon as president, with only Sharon herself voting against it. Gregory became the new president. You would think Sharon would have accepted defeat and moved on. Instead, she doubled down. Unable to use her HOA authority anymore, Sharon filed a lawsuit against me in Maricopa County Superior Court. The complaint alleged that my propane tank was a private nuisance that diminished her property value and enjoyment, and that I had defamed her by making false allegations about her conduct as HOA president. I was served with the lawsuit papers on a Monday morning in October. My hands were shaking as I read through the complaint. Sharon was asking for $50,000 in damages and an injunction requiring me to remove the propane tank. I immediately contacted a lawyer. His name was James Morrison, and he specialized in HOA disputes and property law. After reviewing all my documentation, he seemed confident. "This lawsuit is frivolous," he told me. "She has no grounds for a nuisance claim when your tank meets all applicable codes and regulations. And the defamation claim is baseless because everything you reported about her was true and documented. However, we are still going to need to defend this properly, which means time and money." "How much money?" "If we can get it dismissed early, maybe $5,000 to $10,000. If it goes to trial, could be $20,000 to $30,000. I felt sick. Even though I had a good case, the process itself was the punishment. Sharon knew I would have to spend significant money and time defending myself, and that was probably part of her goal. James filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that Sharon's claims failed as a matter of law. We included all the inspection reports, fire marshal approvals, and documentation showing my tank was completely compliant with all regulations. The hearing on the motion to dismiss was in January. Sharon's lawyer, a sharp-dressed guy named Richard Carlson, argued that his client had a right to a peaceful enjoyment of her property, and that the presence of a large propane tank in the neighborhood diminished that right. Judge Margaret Henderson, who was presiding over the case, did not seem impressed. "Counselor," she said to Richard, "your client's property is across the street from Mr. Quade's. You have submitted no evidence that she can even see this propane tank from her house. How exactly is her peaceful enjoyment being disturbed? Your Honor, it is the knowledge that this industrial-sized tank exists in a residential neighborhood that causes distress to my client. The evidence shows it is not industrial-sized. It is a standard residential propane tank. Do you have any evidence it violates any code or regulation?" Richard shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, there are HOA guidelines that were violated. The HOA itself has determined those guidelines were not violated. The board rescinded the violation." "What is your legal basis for this nuisance claim?" Richard did not have a good answer. Judge Henderson granted the motion to dismiss on the nuisance claim, but allowed the defamation claim to proceed to discovery, saying there were factual questions about whether my statements regarding Sharon's conduct were true. This meant the lawsuit would continue, just on narrower grounds. I was frustrated, but James assured me it was a good outcome. "Discovery is where we are going to bury her," he said. "We are going to depose her, get all her communications, and show exactly what she did. When everything comes out, her defamation claim will fall apart." Discovery began in February. James subpoenaed all of Sharon's emails and communications related to me and the propane tank situation. What we found was stunning. Sharon had sent dozens of emails to other board members, to county officials, and to neighbors, spreading false information about my propane tank. She had claimed it was installed without permits, which was false. She had told people it was leaking, which was false. She had even suggested I was running some kind of illegal business out of my home that required an industrial gas supply, which was completely fabricated. More damning, we found emails where Sharon explicitly talked about wanting to force me out of the neighborhood because she did not like that I had challenged her authority. In one email to another board member, she wrote, "Vincent Quade thinks he can come into this neighborhood and ignore my rules. I am going to make his life so miserable he will have no choice but to sell and leave. Maybe then these people will learn not to cross me." James was thrilled when he read that email. This is gold. Not only does it show malicious intent, it actually supports a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of process. She essentially admitted she has been using false complaints and legal action to punish you. We took Sharon's deposition in March. She was combative and defensive, refusing to admit any wrongdoing despite being confronted with her own emails. Her lawyer kept having to tell her to calm down. When James asked her why she had claimed my propane tank was leaking when it was not, she said, "I received information from a reliable source." What source? I do not recall exactly. You filed an official violation notice alleging a gas leak, which is a serious safety issue, but you cannot recall who told you this information. It was several months ago. I do not remember every detail. Did you personally inspect the tank to verify there was a leak? That is not my job. Did you request documentation from a qualified technician showing there was a leak? I acted on information I believed to be reliable. Information you now cannot recall the source of. Sharon glared at him. I was acting in the best interests of the community. The deposition went on for hours. By the end, Sharon had contradicted herself multiple times and had essentially admitted she had no actual basis for most of the complaints she had filed against me. James filed a motion for summary judgment on the defamation claim, arguing that Sharon had no evidence that anything I said about her was false. He also filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. While all this was happening, things in Desert Palms Estates had improved significantly under Gregory Walsh's leadership as HOA president. He sent out an email to all residents apologizing for the previous administration's behavior and promising a more reasonable approach to enforcement. Several people who had left the neighborhood because of Sharon's harassment actually thanked him. The community felt different. People were friendlier at the mailboxes. The Facebook group had fewer angry arguments. Even small violations were handled with common sense rather than immediate fines. Sharon, meanwhile, had become increasingly isolated. Most of her former allies on the board had distanced themselves. At neighborhood gatherings, people avoided her. Her own husband, Dennis, looked perpetually exhausted. In May, Judge Henderson ruled on the summary judgment motions. She granted James's motion and dismissed Sharon's defamation claim with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. In her written order, the judge noted that the evidence showed my statements about Sharon's conduct were substantially true, and that Sharon had failed to provide any credible evidence to the contrary. However, the judge also allowed my counterclaims to proceed to trial, finding there was sufficient evidence that Sharon had abused the legal process to harass me. Sharon's lawyer, Richard Carlson, apparently advised her to settle at that point. Through James, they offered to drop everything if I agreed not to pursue my counterclaims. James advised me that going to trial would cost more money and time, even though we had a strong case. But I was tired. I had been fighting this battle for nearly a year. It had consumed enormous amounts of my time, energy, and money. I just wanted it to be over. We agreed to a settlement where Sharon would drop her lawsuit, pay my attorney's fees up to that point, which totaled about $18,000, and sign an agreement promising not to file any further complaints or legal action against me regarding the propane tank or any other matter, unless there was a genuine violation of law or regulation confirmed by an independent third party. The settlement was finalized in June. I finally felt like I could breathe again, but there was one more twist. In August, I got a call from Kelly at Prestige Property Management. "Vincent, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We received a complaint from several residents about Sharon Pemberton." "What kind of complaint?" "Multiple residents are alleging that Sharon was embezzling HOA funds during her time as president. The treasurer was going through old records for the annual audit and found some irregularities. We are investigating, but it looks like Sharon approved payments to fake vendors and pocketed the money." I was stunned. How much money are we talking about? Potentially over $30,000 across 3 years. Are you involving the police? "Our legal team is reviewing everything first. If the evidence supports criminal charges, yes, we will be reporting it to law enforcement." Over the next few weeks, the investigation unfolded. The auditor found that Sharon had created false invoices from landscaping companies, maintenance contractors, and other vendors who either did not exist or had no record of doing business with Desert Palms Estates. She had then approved payments to these fake vendors, and the checks had been deposited into bank accounts she controlled. The HOA board voted unanimously to refer the matter to the Scottsdale Police Department. In September, detectives interviewed Sharon. They also executed a search warrant on her home and seized financial records. In October, Sharon Pemberton was formally charged with theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The charges alleged she had stolen over $37,000 from the Desert Palms Estates HOA over a period of 4 years. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had supported Sharon were shocked. Some felt betrayed. Others said they had suspected something was off, but had not known what to do about it. Dennis Pemberton filed for divorce shortly after the charges were announced. He apparently had no knowledge of what Sharon had been doing and was horrified by the whole situation. Sharon's criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring. I was not directly involved, but I was listed as a potential witness because the prosecution wanted to establish a pattern of Sharon abusing her position as HOA president for personal gain. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the fraudulent payments. Bank records showed the money had been deposited into accounts Sharon controlled and used for personal expenses, including luxury vacations and designer clothing purchases. Sharon's defense attorney tried to argue that she had made accounting mistakes, but had not intended to steal. The jury did not buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they found her guilty on all counts. In May, Sharon Pemberton was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus penalties. She was also permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. When I heard the sentence, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that it was truly over, vindication that Sharon's abuse of power had been exposed and punished, but also a certain sadness that things had escalated to this point. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to install a propane tank so I could heat my house and run my appliances efficiently. Life in Desert Palms Estates improved dramatically after Sharon's removal. Gregory Walsh continued as HOA president and appointed new board members who were actually interested in serving the community rather than controlling it. The board updated the covenants to remove vague clauses and establish clear, objective standards for everything from paint colors to exterior installations. They even added a clause specifically allowing propane tanks up to 1,000 gallons, as long as they met fire code requirements. Several other residents ended up installing propane systems after seeing mine, especially as natural gas prices fluctuated. Frank Martinez became one of my closest friends. We had barbecues in each other's backyards, and he helped me train Max some new tricks. Linda Chen finally got approval for her vegetable garden, which was now recognized as one of the nicest features in the neighborhood. Maria Sanchez was able to park her work van in her driveway without harassment. The community felt like an actual community again. People looked out for each other. Board meetings focused on legitimate maintenance and improvement issues rather than petty enforcement actions. There was still the occasional disagreement about rules and standards, but these were handled with common sense and good faith rather than vindictiveness. I learned a lot from the whole experience. I learned that standing up to bullies, even when it is hard and expensive, is sometimes necessary. I learned that documentation is critical when dealing with people who abuse authority. I learned that most people are reasonable and fair-minded if given accurate information and a chance to do the right thing. I also learned that giving someone unchecked power, even in something as mundane as an HOA board, can lead to terrible outcomes. Sharon Pemberton was not a monster. She was an ordinary person who got drunk on the small amount of authority she had and progressively became worse, until she was literally stealing from her neighbors and destroying lives over a propane tank. My 500-gallon propane tank is still sitting behind my house, painted white, behind the screening fence, exactly where it has always been. It quietly provides fuel for my heating system, my stove, my water heater, and my pool heater. It does its job efficiently and safely, just as the technicians promised it would. Sometimes I look at it and shake my head at everything that happened because of it. A standard residential propane tank that somehow became the center of a year-long war with an HOA president that ended with her going to prison. On summer evenings, I sit on my back patio with Max at my feet, looking at that tank and the rest of my yard, feeling grateful for my home and my neighborhood. The whole ordeal cost me probably $30,000 in legal fees, stress, and time, even after the settlement from Sharon. But I got to keep my house and my propane tank, and more importantly, I got to be part of fixing a broken system that was hurting a lot of people. Desert Palms Estates is not perfect. No HOA ever is, but it is a lot better than it was. People actually like living here now. The board serves the community instead of ruling over it. And when issues come up, they are handled fairly based on actual rules and standards rather than the whims of a petty tyrant. Last month, Gregory organized a neighborhood barbecue at the clubhouse. Over 100 people showed up. Kids ran around playing while adults talked and laughed. Someone set up a volleyball net. People brought food to share. It felt like what a neighborhood is supposed to feel like. At one point during the barbecue, a new resident who had just moved in approached me. His name was Michael, and he had bought Dennis and Sharon's old house after their divorce. "Hey, I heard you were the guy who stood up to the crazy HOA president," Michael said. "I wanted to thank you. I did my research before buying here, and the improvements in how the HOA operates were a big factor in my decision. This seems like a great place to live now." "It is," I told him honestly. "It took some work to get here, but it was worth it." Michael looked around at all the neighbors enjoying themselves. "I cannot imagine what it must have been like before. Everyone here seems so nice and normal." "Most of them always were," I said. "They just needed someone to stand up to a bully first. After that, everyone else found their courage too." As I drove home from the barbecue that evening, Max in the passenger seat with his head out the window, I reflected on everything that had happened. The stress, the money, the legal battles, the months of harassment. It had been one of the most difficult experiences of my life. But I had learned that property rights matter. That rules need to be clear and fairly enforced. That authority without accountability leads to abuse. And that sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when it is hard, even when it would be easier to just give in and move on. My house on Saguaro Lane in Scottsdale, Arizona, is just a regular 3-bedroom ranch with a decent backyard. But it is my house. And the 500-gallon propane tank behind it is my tank, installed legally and properly, providing safe and efficient fuel for my home. Sharon Pemberton tried to take that away from me based on nothing more than her personal dislike and her interpretation of a vague rule. She escalated and escalated, unable to accept that she did not have absolute power. And in the end, her abuse of authority did not just cost her the HOA presidency. It cost her freedom, her marriage, and her reputation. I do not take any pleasure in that outcome. I would have preferred if she had just left my propane tank alone from the beginning, and none of this had ever happened. But people like Sharon cannot leave things alone. They cannot let perceived challenges to their authority go unanswered. They have to win every battle, even ones that do not matter, even when winning means destroying someone else. The system protected me in the end. The HOA board eventually did the right thing. The courts saw through Sharon's frivolous lawsuit. The police investigated and prosecuted her crimes. But it took months of effort, thousands of dollars, and the support of good neighbors and competent professionals. Not everyone has those resources. Not everyone can afford lawyers and court costs. Not everyone has the personality to stand up to bullying and harassment month after month. A lot of people in my situation would have just removed the propane tank, taken the financial loss, and tried to keep their heads down. I do not blame anyone who makes that choice. Sometimes the fight is not worth it, but I am glad I fought. I am glad I documented everything, hired a good lawyer, and saw it through to the end. Not just for me, but for everyone else in Desert Palms Estates who was suffering under Sharon's regime and did not know how to stop it. The experience changed me. I pay much closer attention to local governance now, even at the HOA level. I read the board meeting minutes. I show up to votes on important issues. I ask questions when things do not make sense. I encourage other residents to do the same. Democracy, even neighborhood democracy, requires participation and vigilance. When people check out and let others run things without oversight, abuse becomes inevitable. It does not matter if it is a city council or an HOA board. Power concentrates, corruption creeps in, and before you know it, someone is stealing money and ruining lives over a propane tank. As I pulled into my driveway that evening, I saw the propane tank through the screening fence. Just a white cylindrical tank doing its job, completely unremarkable except for all the drama it had somehow caused. Max jumped out of the truck and ran to the backyard, ready for his dinner. I followed him, unlocking the door and stepping into my home, my completely normal, perfectly legal, properly maintained home with its standard residential propane tank. And I felt deeply, profoundly grateful that justice had prevailed, that the system had worked, and that Sharon Pemberton was no longer in a position to hurt anyone else with her petty tyranny and criminal behavior. The sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I poured myself a drink, sat on the back patio, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of my property, with my propane tank humming softly in the background, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was over. Finally, completely, truly over. And life could go on, normal and peaceful in the nicest neighborhood in Scottsdale, Arizona, free from the reign of an HOA president who thought she was above the law and could target residents based on personal vendettas. Justice had been served. The community had been restored. And my 500-gallon propane tank remained exactly where it belonged, a silent testament to the importance of standing your ground when you are right, no matter how powerful or vindictive your opponent might be.